So beginning the recording now. We spent some time studying the life, the reign, the times of King Ramesses II in our last session together. And so today we are going to look at his legacy in those who followed after him. And we're gonna look at his dynasty, um, how it developed, how it ended, and it would be um, it would not be an overstatement to say that Ramesses might be, at least arguably, Ramesses the Great might be the most famous of all Egyptian kings, certainly one of the most popular in popular culture in the Western world today. I would think that there might be, in total, there might be four pharaohs who would be in the argument for the most famous, the most well known, the most popular, however you want to put that. But I would think that there might be four that could be in that conversation. Um, Ramesses the Second or Ramesses the Great is one. Anybody want to guess who the other three are, or one of the other three?
Tut.
Yep, Tutankhamun. Um, he definitely is in the conversation. Um, you know, he's one of those rare people who, millennia after his death, has gone on a tour of the world and drawn great crowds. Um,
That and
Tutankhamun.
some more than either one of that all of us put together.
Yep. Tutankhamun would definitely be high on the list of possible candidates for most famous pharaoh. Kevin, what do you think? Can you think of another one? By the way, you're on mute, Kevin.
I thought that's how Lauren liked me. The only one I can think of because of other movies I've watched is, or not movies, but archaeologists. Amenhotep.
Okay.
Um, it's just that's the name I've heard outside of this class.
Yeah, I would say the Pharaoh of the Exodus, um, who is unnamed in Scripture, of course. Some think it's Ramesses II. I think it was Amenhotep. But Amenhotep or Amenhotep would definitely be one of the leading candidates to be the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And if he is, then certainly he would be among the most well known. Um, the other one that comes to my mind is Cleopatra, the last of the pharaohs of Egypt. The interesting thing is, most people forget that she was pharaoh, right? They think of her as, the consort of Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. They forget that she was actually pharaoh. She was the last of the pharaohs. So, um, but King Tut, Ramesses II, Amenhotep, Cleopatra, whoever the pharaoh of the Exodus was, those are names that people will remember. There were actually a lot of kings of Egypt named Ramesses. There were a handful named Amenhotep, and there were a handful named Tutankhamun. But the ones that we all think of are those. In all of history, and at least as far as great rulers of kingdoms, there has only ever been one Cleopatra, and she was certainly a unique woman. Um, but you can only imagine that for the offspring of Ramesses II, he's a tough act to follow. He reigned for over 6 decades. He defeated the Hittites. He expanded the empire. He ushered in a period of great um, economic and social development. The development in science was great during his time, and he will always be remembered for those things. Um, he had great religious significance in that he built a lot of temples. He he restored a lot of the old sanctuaries and the funeral uh, chambers for some of the pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings. But eventually, he did die, as we discussed at the end of last week's lesson, and his son had to reign in his place. Now, it's interesting that Merenptah was the 13th son of Ramesses II. Anybody want to guess why Ramesses' 13th son would have reigned instead of any of his 12 older brothers?
Death of natural causes.
Um, well, if by that you mean assassination, the answer is no. Um, but but you are half right. Um, Merenptah happened to be the only surviving son of Ramesses by the time the old geezer died.
Oh wow.
He Ramesses II outlived his first 12 sons. And so Meren essentially became the pharaoh by default. And he himself did not have a very long reign because he was an old man by the time he got to be the pharaoh. Um, he quickly aligned himself with his father image. He wanted to be seen as a warrior king. So what Mernptah did was he went to war with the Libyans. I don't know if he chose the Libyans because he thought they would be an easy victory and he needed one, or if it was simply because they were a problem at the time. But he not only defeated the Libyans, but he drove back an invasion of the Sea Peoples. We're coming into the period of time known as the Bronze Age collapse, which we will discuss more tomorrow when the topic is the Bronze Age collapse and how it affected the entire Mediterranean world, but it will play prominently in today's stories about Egypt. He drove back the Sea Peoples. He he did stelas in which he provided stories of his campaigns against the Libyans and his wars with the Sea Peoples in order to make sure that he was thought of as being like the uh, the the reign of his father Ramesses II. He's also very famous for something else. There is a stela which Merenptah apparently commissioned, which has a very important people group named in it.
Oh,
Does anyone remember what that was?
I don't remember what it's called, but it has an inscription naming the Hebrews or Israelites.
Yeah, it's called. It's often referred to as the Israel Stela because it is one of the oldest external references to Israel by a foreign power, by a non-Israeli source, and it specifically names Israel as a people group living in the land of Canaan or living in the Levant, what some today call the land of Palestine. So that's an important contribution to history from this son, this 13th son of King Ramesses, who inherited his father's throne. He was then succeeded by Amenmesi, who was probably not supposed to be king. he was likely a usurper who was trying to steal power from Seti II, who was the rightful appointed chosen heir of his father, King Mernptah. And so he didn't reign very long, Amen Messi, about 3 years, less than 3 years. But when he was finally removed, then Seti II seized power. He also apparently tried to erase any evidence of Seti II. Okay. Um, he tried to erase essentially the rightful king from being remembered. However, when he died, um, he tried to, well, first of all, he forced his kingship on the court against the court's wishes. We don't really know exactly when he died, but he vanishes from the record of kingship around 1200 BC, and Seti II will reign until 1197. So he was the actual pharaoh, and apparently his relative tried to steal the throne from him. But Seti II was the real king, and he would reign for a few years. Neither of these kings reigned for very long. Um, Merenptah himself didn't reign very long either, only for about 10 years, and then these two, his sons, reigned after him for about 6 years total between the two of them. Um, One thing about Seti II was that he followed a lot of the things that his father had put in place. The building projects that he had begun were continued by his son. The Temple of Karnak that he had begun to make additions to, he continued. He followed the precepts that his father had laid down as new laws. Um, and he was succeeded by a grandson of Meremptah who was Meremptah Siptah, and he was 10 years old when he came to the throne. Siptah reigned for 6 years and died at the age of 16. Um, it's possible that there was some monkey business going on because his stepmother, Tusret, also known as Pasret, actually had been his regent, and she took over as queen when he died. So it's possible that his stepmother may have killed him to take the throne, but we don't know that for sure. When she finally died, after her own short lived reign of around a year or even less than a year, um, I'm sorry. Yeah. When first of all, let me say we don't know that she killed her stepson. I want to be clear about that, but it's possible, or she had him killed. After her very short-lived reign, a new dynasty would come into being because the last ruler of Dynasty 19, the first Ramesside dynasty, was in fact Queen Tasret, and it may be argued that she was never a legitimate ruler of the dynasty. Following Dynasty 12, Dynasty 19 comes Dynasty 20, XIX to XX, of course, also known as the Second Ramesside Dynasty. After Tasret, Setnakti becomes the next ruler. Um, some people suggest that he was a usurper, that he had stolen the throne, and that he was most likely one of the sons of Seti II. However, if that's the case, he did not mention it. If he were in fact a grandson or a son of Seti II, if he were really descended from Ramesses, then you would expect him to say that he was part of the same dynasty. But in fact, Setnakti, even though he took the throne name Ramesses III, he does not appear, excuse me, even though his son took the throne name Ramesses III, they do not appear to actually be related to the original Ramesses and Ramesses II. Stagnaki did stabilize the government, but a lot of the records from his time are somewhat contradictory. And there seems to be some confusion even among the contemporaries about what happened there. There may have been another attempted invasion of the Sea Peoples during that time, and that he drove them off. It's also possible that he could have simply been repeating a story of something that had already happened. What we do know is that after his reign, which only lasted about 4 years, Ramesses III came to the throne. Ramesses III is best known for being the one who finally defeated the Sea Peoples and drove them from the coast of Egypt. He was the one who kept them out of the Nile and off of the Nile Delta, made them go away for good. His inscriptions talk about his Sea People's battles quite a bit. He claims that his father had fought them previously, but it's not widely supported by other data. Ramesses III will be the last pharaoh that you could call militarily strong in the New Kingdom era. It seems that during his time, the power of the Amun priesthood and the Amun cult had continued to get stronger and stronger, and Horemheb revived the old religion, and they continue to draw revenue and influence away from the pharaohs. As had happened in the time of Akhenaten, the priests of Amun actually had more land holdings than the pharaohs did. They were considered to be greater authorities in the provinces and in the outlying areas. They had greater influence than the kings did. This would get worse and worse throughout the 20th dynasty, um, the second Ramessid dynasty of the Ramessid period. But one thing that Ramesses III did is he maintained a strong central government. He was able to maintain control. He kept the borders secure, and Egypt was prosperous, but it was as though it was prosperous and it was slipping away from the pharaoh at the same time. Um, in Egypt, it seemed as though being pharaoh no longer held the kind of prestige and respect that it had in previous times. And instead of him being the representative of the gods, it became more the priests of Amun who would become the representatives of the gods. He was actually wounded in an assassination attempt orchestrated by one of his own wives, one of his own harem, not his queen, but his lesser wife, and he later died from the injuries. So he survived the assassination attempt, but he did die from the injuries. So ultimately, it was successful. His son, who reigned for about 6 years after him, was Ramesses IV. And he came to the throne only because, once again, all of his older brothers were dead. So he tried to be like one of the great pharaohs of days gone by, but he didn't do a lot. He did accomplish a lot of building projects, but he was having trouble because his empire was shrinking. And he reigned, as I said, for less than 6 years and then died. He was followed by his own son, Ramesses V, and he also reigned for a shorter period of time, only about 6 to 7 years. He was losing more and more power to the priests, and he didn't last long before Ramesses VI came up. I just realized um, we could probably, um, oops, we could probably look at Ramesses the fourth then as one of the great um, the great pharaohs of his time. I should mention that there are also records during the reign of Ramesses III and the Fourth of there being strikes and workforce problems. It is said that during the reign of Ramesses the Fourth and Ramesses the Third, the laborers were not being given their grain, and their allotment of grain was essentially how they were paid. So imagine then it's one thing not to be able to be paid, but if you don't have anything to eat, it's hard to work. At one point, their payment was late by 8 days, and then it was late again by 20 days. And finally, when they had received no grain, they came and they went on strike and they demanded that they be paid so they could eat or they would not work. The vizier visited around this time, but he was not coming because he was there to settle the worker strike or to encourage the workers. He was coming to borrow some of the statues for an upcoming royal event that the pharaoh was putting on. And he was accosted by the workers and their bosses who came to him, and he essentially said, "Get back to work." Um, Egypt continues to slip away little by little throughout the reigns of the succeeding kings. During the reign of Ramesses IV, it really began to become a shrinking empire. When he died, Ramesses V had even more trouble holding the empire together, and the priests became more and more powerful. Ramesses VI, who actually ruled for about 8 years, continued to have the same problems, and he succeeded no better. Instead of having any great accomplishments in his or monumental projects to his credit, Ramesses VI is best known only for his tomb, but not for any great riches found inside. When they found the tomb of Ramesses VI, they found that the workmen had inadvertently buried the earlier tomb of Tutankhamun, which kept Tutankhamun's tomb safe from grave robbers until the 20th century. So the number one claim to fame that Ramesses VI has is that his tomb, inadvertently being buried on top of Tutankhamun's, is the reason we have the great Tutankhamun Museum display exhibit that goes around the world even to this day. Then came Ramesses VII, who reigned for about 7 years, and following him came Ramesses VIII, who lasted about a year, maybe less. We don't know anything about Ramesses VIII except that he was the son of Ramesses VII, and his son was Ramesses IX. Ramesses IX actually managed to reign for a fairly long time, almost 20 years, about 18 to 19 years. Ramesses X came and went in about 4 years. And then Ramesses XI would reign for 10 years. These pharaohs were losing the empire more and more. The priests were rising up and taking more and more power. And the priests of Amun thought that was a good thing, but it never occurred to them without the political and military power of the pharaohs, Egypt was going to fall prey to its enemies. One episode about the struggle between the priests and the pharaohs talks about um, the the man named Amenhotep, the high priest of Amun, not one of the pharaonic Amenhoteps, but the high priest of Amun, known as Amenhotep, ousted from his office by Finehasi, the vizier, who then had to flee to Nubia because even though he was the vizier, the priests of Amun were actually more powerful. It seems that this Amenhotep, the high priest, was then reinstated by Ramesses XI during the Weham Masut, which literally means the rebirth of culture. But it seems that it was at this time that the Egyptian monarchy finally fell apart, declining rapidly. Some ancient fragments of the records give us this idea that Amenhotep was placed back at Thebes as the high priest. Others claim he was succeeded by another priest whose name was Herihor. Unlike the rest of the New Kingdom, the records from this time are fragmentary. They're hard to understand, and we just don't have very many. The only aspect about this that is clear is that the priests of Amun had enough power that they reigned as pharaohs themselves from Thebes and called themselves pharaohs. Ultimately, the division between the rule of the Theban uh, the Theban Ramesses rulers in the the rule of the Theban priests and the Ramessean rulers who ruled in Lower Egypt up north seems to have led to the fall of the 20th dynasty and with it the New Kingdom and the onset of the third intermediate period. During that time, of course, there would be no strong central government in Egypt, and the policies of the past, which had preserved the empire, ceased to work. One historian has said that there was little to no administrative competence after Ramesses III. The 20th dynasty in the New Kingdom was destroyed because the priests of Amun simply would not allow the pharaohs to run their own empire. I would say that's a pretty rotten way for the kingdom to come to an end. Um, this is an example of why Western civilization today is founded so much on the idea of the separation of church and state. It's not actually a Jewish Christian influence so much as we have seen time and time again what happens when secular power and sacred power intermingle, intermix, or are not kept fully separate. And with that, I will throw it open for questions regarding the fall of the New Kingdom era, because we're going to pick up the third intermediate period and the late kingdom next semester.
Was it during that time frame that um, incest became a problem?
Well,
It was.
among the kings of Egypt and most of the imperial families of world history, that has always been a problem. One of the ways that you could keep power united in the family was by not marrying outside of it. So you'll see that problem going back all the way to the first king, the early kingdom era. So in Egypt, Kevin, you have any questions?
I'm just trying to keep all of these numbers down and hoping that you're not going to quiz me on which Ramses did what.
As long as you can remember which Ramesses was also known as Ramesses the Great, probably will do okay.
He was the second Ramses.
Yes. So yeah, that I wouldn't be too I wouldn't be too concerned about that. Um, all right. So wow. Oddly enough, we just went through that entire lecture, and our class time is not scheduled to end for 40 minutes. So I did not expect that to go so fast. I always generally expect you guys to have more questions and interaction. So um,
Oh, I know Lauren's letting us down today.
Well, I don't know, all these pharaohs and all of that. Of course, there's going to be a lot of them. just because Egypt's been a country for so long.
Right.
But I do have trouble with the which and what era and and all of that. When you said that Cleopatra was the last of the pharaohs, um, was there something of significance take over after her, or is that just kind of
Yeah, the answer is Rome.
do what?
Rome is what came after her. Instead of
No.
instead of maintaining Egypt as a vassal kingdom, they essentially made it an imperial province.
Okay. I knew that Cleopatra had married Julius Caesar. I'm sure that was political.
Yes.
Uh, and once Julius Caesar was taken out, Rome was fought over by the three leading generals, Augustus being one of them, Mark Antony being another one of them. That even though she married Mark Antony, it seems like that they were allowed to finish their tour there, but they weren't really rewarded to be part of Rome. The benefits of it.
Right.
So yeah, politics makes some strange bedfellows. That's for sure.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. You may be wondering why we're ending Egypt next semester with with one final lesson instead of going all the way to Cleopatra. The answer is we are going all the way to Cleopatra and beyond. But what happens after the fall of the New Kingdom and the Third Intermediate Period and the Late Kingdom era is that essentially Egypt will be absorbed into the Greek Empire with Alexander the Great and his successors. So as we're studying Greece next semester, part of that study will be its conquest of Egypt. Um, and you'll notice that you'll start to notice that the pharaohs of Egypt will have very Greek names. All right. Well, if you guys have no other questions, then I guess we can actually conclude this lesson early because it appears I've outdone myself and brought us to an early conclusion, which is not normal for me, I will say. So, all right, guys, have a
All
marvelous
right.
uh, fresh break, and I'll see you in chapel.
Okay.